All right, so we have Robert Brzezinski, who is our DAS for Europe and Eurasia,
And South and Central.
South and Central. I don't know. I'm not enough caffeine. South and Central Asia. I apologize. He will be speaking first. I think we're just going to go in order. Ani Blair, who's the office director for our Office of Near East and Near East Affairs, who is substituting for our DAS, Daphne Rand, who I believe is on travel or in a meeting.
She's on travel.
On travel?
She's speaking at Harvard today.
Oh, she's speaking at Harvard today. Third, I believe, is probably the nameplate that says Scott Busby, our Deputy Assistant Secretary for EAP and Multilateral Affairs. I can guarantee you that is not Das Busby, but instead a very able substitute, which is Jen Nyhart, our Deputy Director for our Office of East Asia Pacific Affairs. Moving on, we have Steve Feldstein, who is our DAS for Africa and International Labor Affairs. And then lastly, we have our Deputy Assistant Secretary, Mike Kozak, who works on affairs in the Western Hemisphere in the Latin American countries, as well as, no, Daphne's Security and Human Rights, sorry. So they are going to speak a few minutes about what they see happening in their region or in their areas. And again, we will be able to take questions from them as well. So I'll just turn it over to you, Rob.
All right. Is this on? Hi, good morning. I didn't realize the crowd would be this large. This is amazing. Thanks for coming out. Rob Brzezinski. I'm the Deputy Assistant Secretary covering 2 regional bureaus, so Europe, EUR, and then also SCA, the South and Central Asia Bureau. So I'm just going to kind of run down policy priorities. If anybody wants to interrupt me and ask a question, feel free. I'll start with my European portfolio. I've got roughly 4 priorities. If I pass over anything again, please let me know. I'm going to start with closed European societies. So this is a bucket I place Russia, Azerbaijan, and Belarus in. Russia's a top priority. We are continuing in this year of Duma elections to do what we can to support Russian civil society and free media. Spend a lot of time working on media issues. So this is Russian language media, both that gets into the country and also in the Russian-speaking periphery. And then also a lot of time on the Magnitsky list, both as relates to the case of Sergei Magnitsky, but also the element of that act, for those that are familiar with it, that deals with other gross violations of human rights and how we can maximize that legislation. On Azerbaijan, top priority is getting additional political prisoners out. For those that follow Azerbaijan closely, you'll have noticed that over the course of the last couple of weeks, we've gotten roughly 16 people out of prison in what is otherwise a very, very difficult and continuing to be downward-looking environment for civil society. And then in Belarus, working towards continuing to make incremental gains, again, in a very closed society, related to Belarus's dire economic condition and, to be perfectly frank, being pretty transactional with that government in terms of what we can provide in economic terms through limited sanctions relief, which we announced roughly 4 months ago in return for additional positive steps from the government with respect to political opposition and civil society in that country. As with the case with Russia, we approach elections in the fall. Second bucket is Ukraine. We have a new government as of yesterday, and DRL is just one of the many offices within the State Department and the White House and DOD that are working towards continuing the drive for positive reform and anti-corruption in Ukraine while supporting the government as it continues to fight a war against Russian-backed proxies in the east and to push back against the illegal annexation of Crimea in the south. DRL has a particularly strong role in Ukraine, apart from anti-corruption and support to civil society, in our Crimea policy. So I spend a lot of time working on Crimea issues, and in the year to come, I was out there about a month ago, and in the year to come we'll continue to place great emphasis on doing what we can for Crimea's Tatar community, other residents of the peninsula, and working with the new government of Ukraine to maximally connect the greater part of Ukraine with its citizens on the peninsula. Third bucket is working with European backsliders. So I don't want to make too much of that title. There are certainly more differences between countries here than there are similarities, but I would place Hungary, Turkey, and Poland into this group. So I'm not going to spend a lot of time on the particulars of each one, but we can talk about those during the Q&A. And finally, transnational issues. I would place Roma into this category, and then also our great work at the OSCE. On the latter, it's a big year. We've got the Germans in the chairmanship, so a strong OSCE chairmanship. And the OSCE has never been more important in terms of what its institutions are doing. ODIHR, very active across the region, as I'm sure many of you know. We have an ODIHR voting monitoring mission coming up in Russia, among other places this year. The OSCE is active in Ukraine through its special monitoring mission, and the Russians, among others, are being particularly difficult in terms of some of these institutions, certainly ODIHR, but also the representative of freedom on the media. So a lot of work through the OSCE. Moving to South and Central Asia, 4 priorities here too. First is Sri Lanka and supporting that government as it moves towards increasing democratic reforms and on the path it charted for itself most publicly last September in the joint resolution we co-sponsored with the government of Sri Lanka at the Human Rights Council on its justice and accountability efforts. So DRL is doing a lot of work in terms of both working with activists and the government to ensure that all of Sri Lanka's citizens, both Tamil and Sinhalese, have a say in the future course of their country. Second is Bangladesh. I would say that this is a focus for DRL, but also for the State Department more broadly in the year to come. A lot of focus on the killings of secular bloggers and religious minorities in the country. We have a particular interest in making sure that transnational terrorist groups don't gain a foothold in this highly populated and secular and pluralistic South Asian country. My particular role comes in terms of our countering violent extremism efforts and doing counterterrorism smarter through a rights-based approach, but also larger issues of governance that undergird a lot of the violence that we see in Bangladesh, certainly on the terrorism side, but also in terms of political violence. Third is Central Asia. Obviously a very tough neighborhood for those that track it. This Secretary Kerry announced last year on a trip that I was able to join him on that the United States would be setting up a new multilateral mechanism for the region. We call it the C5. Those are the Central Asian countries, +1, that's us. So a lot of work will go in this year in making sure that the citizens and rights groups within this region, and this is a region in which in several countries there's very little oxygen for these groups, notwithstanding some of the great work that many of you in this room do, have a voice in both that process, but more importantly, how their governments are treating citizens on the ground. And then lastly, Afghanistan and Pakistan. Afghanistan, the emphasis is very much on maintaining the gains that have been made in the country over the past 12, 13 years or so. We have a focus on security sector accountability in both Afghanistan and Pakistan, working with DAFNA and the Security and Human Rights Office. So this is heavy emphasis on the applicability of the Leahy Law, but other mechanisms as well. In Afghanistan, we've got a particular focus on women, children, and protecting journalists. And then in Pakistan, we've got a government that recently released a new comprehensive action plan on human rights. So it's working with senior officials within the Sharif government on implementing that plan. Thanks.
Good morning. Is my microphone on? Okay.
My name is Ani Blair, and I'm the Office Director for our Near Eastern Affairs Office within the Bureau of Democracy, Human Rights, and Labor. Our region is very interesting, so I'm just going to pick out a couple of buckets to talk about, as my colleague did here. I would start with some trends that we see across the region. First of all, there is a heavy focus from our Bureau on protecting civilians and protecting civil society. Across the region, you see a number of mechanisms that are being used to kind of crack down on civil society, and in particular, the implementation and enforcement of counterterrorism laws as well as cybersecurity laws. So using the rule of law as a mechanism to have a way that seems legitimate from the outside to control something, but when you actually examine it, is shutting down the type of dialogue that helps a democracy or even a stable place survive. In addition to that, there is also the trend of, or what we're also trying to work on is across the region, is countering violent extremism. And this goes across all of the bureaus, but particularly in this region, you want to make sure that civilian voices have a voice and that they are able to peacefully express their grievances and criticisms of whether it be the government, security forces, or other elements of society without fearing the threat of being thrown into prison or losing their lives. It goes both ways, and so you want people to be able to have that opportunity to express their grievances peacefully, and to not have that sort of mechanism to release their frustrations be conflated with countering violent extremism, which is focused on making sure that violent voices that do drive people to extremism are allowed to be moderated, or even just have a sort of balanced mechanism there. You've probably all seen the White House CVE summit that has gone on, and other ways that we address countering violent extremism. But watching out for how that is conflated with peaceful mechanisms is a dangerous space for us. Looking more specifically at some of the countries and what we do in some of those countries, I'll start out with Syria, where there's a lot of attention. We work with a number of people in society, even though it is very difficult to access, to make sure that civilians are protected. And that means that doing everything from working with documentation to make sure that abuses are brought to light, but also to make sure that there is evidence for accountability and justice efforts that may happen later. Also, we put a lot of effort into working with civil society to make sure that their voices are heard. Civil society has been responsible for a number of things that have gone on, including working with government elements to make sure that even local governments, in some cases, are able to survive, as well as civil society has been critical to some of the ceasefires, the local ceasefires that have happened in very few and small ways across the country. In addition to working with civil society on civilian protection and making sure that it is able to continue, we also work with civil society to make sure that they are included in peace negotiations and that their voices are heard for peace talks. On the other side of the conflict zone, in the same area, we work with civil society in Iraq, in particular making sure that there is documentation as well there for the protection of citizens. In particular, the abuses by ISIL have been documented, and the information can be used in the future, we hope, for accountability purposes. Also making sure that there are ways to help civil society to be able to survive what they're encountering from the abuses by ISIL. In particular, we've worked closely to try to make sure that or to promote psychosocial support and counseling for those who have been abused by ISIL or other elements, and to make sure that that is integrated into future stabilization planning. That sort of effort is important not only now, for being able to integrate back into society, but also for the future. In order for there to be stability and reconciliation, we also have to think about how people are able to cope with the disaster and the horrific scenes that they've seen. In Egypt and Bahrain, last year in both places we lifted security assistance holds that had been put in place for a year and a half to almost 2 years. And in both places, we've been very clear that we are still not pleased with the human rights situation. In Bahrain, the secretary and our assistant secretary, Tom Malinowski, who just spoke, visited very recently and promoted a message of human rights and reconciliation that we have documented and made statements about a number of times. We've also called for the release of prisoners there and urged the government of Bahrain to implement the recommendations that were made after 2011 and the uprising that happened in Bahrain, which focused largely on accountability and integrating more civilian checks in the security forces. On the other side, on Egypt, a couple of weeks ago, I want to say a month ago now, the U.S. released a statement on the crackdown on civil society there, focusing particularly on a trend that we're seeing of people being thrown into jail or into detention arbitrarily or for posting something on Twitter or on Facebook or just doing their jobs. Civil society organizations being shut down, and the renewal of the NGO trials that started in 2012 against NGOs that were, and people working for those NGOs that were closed down. In addition to the United States making that statement, there were a number of other countries that, including Germany, France, and the UK, that also issue statements on that. That all goes to say that that is a major focus for us. We've called for the release of prisoners in Egypt, those that have been peacefully activists who have peacefully stated their criticisms of the government and were thrown into jail, and working to protect civilians who continue to work in that space. And then across the Gulf, we work on a number of cases and have called for the release of prisoners as well who have peacefully expressed their criticism of government and have been arbitrarily detained and remain in prison. And we also work on a number of issues of revolving around labor and labor rights, particularly for third country nationals who are working in those countries. I would also just state that in addition to the kind of regional focus, it's important to think about how we do our work. Often people think of human rights as just making statements, and that is a part of it, but there's private diplomacy that goes on in addition to that sort of public outreach. There are the conferences like the ones that I mentioned earlier that talk about these issues, but there's also the daily engagement, working with civil society, making sure that you know who they are, making sure that you know who the people who are in prison, that we know their stories, making sure that when a country like Tunisia, the bright spot in this region, is trying to make significant reforms on decentralization and anti-corruption, that they have the technical assistance that they need. For their security reforms, that they know how to talk to civilians and civilians know how to talk to them. And also in Tunisia, making sure that as their parliament develops, that their parliament actually knows how to be a parliament. How do you listen to think tanks and academics and other people around your communities to find out what they want laws on? And how do you communicate what the laws mean back to society? So thinking about all of that, I think, is important. It's not just statements for human rights, but that continual engagement across society, including security forces, including government, including opposition leaders, and people who are everyday people working there just like you and I. Thank you.
Good morning. How is everyone today? Good. Well, I will tell you, it was just the luck of the draw that I'm here today, and I couldn't be happier. I know that my dad, Scott Busby, regrets not being able to be here. He's actually at the White House talking about Burma this morning, so otherwise he would be here with you. First of all, well, I hope that I'm able to share some of the insights on the thinking on policy in the region in East Asia and Pacific. But I was hoping to first get a sense of how many of your organizations have either worked in East Asia and the Pacific or plan to make proposals. Could I see a show of hands? Oh, that's great. So I hope that by the end of this 5 minutes that I'm talking about our policy priorities, that everyone's hand will go up in the room because we need everybody there on the ground. There's a lot going on. I also just wanted to say that as someone who has worked in the field, I'm a Foreign Service officer, worked in the field in Asia, Europe, and Latin America. I just want to tell you very sincerely how much I admire your work. I know it's difficult. I know it's very difficult to work in the operating environments. And I have been continually impressed with the ability of non-government organizations, American and otherwise, to work in these difficult environments, to be tenacious, to zig, zag, and importantly, to be flexible in adjusting how you measure success when our goal is here and what we get is here, and to keep moving forward and to just have the perseverance that is important for the long-run change that we're looking for. So with that, I would just like to share a couple of thoughts in terms of policy priorities and how we think in DRL about our strategy in the region. I know that you all dream about the rebalance and that you hear it in your sleep, and I know I do. So the president, of course, has a top policy priority, with the rebalance, which was originally a pivot, now it's a rebalance to Asia. Democratic values and protecting fundamental freedoms is a core part of that, and it really is a core part of that. That's not just sort of State Department diplo speak. It actually is a core part of what we do, and that's reflected in our funding. That's reflected in our resources, and it also means that we're not only engaging with our longtime allies. We have many very significant treaty allies in the region, but we're developing new friendships, new relationships there, emerging relationships with Vietnam, with Laos, with Cambodia, with others. And what happens when you do that is that you change the status quo. So nothing is the same as it was. It's making an impact. It's changing the whole configuration in the chessboard, if you will. So there's a lot of movement, a lot of opportunity in East Asia right now and the Pacific. A key part of this rebalance is a commitment by the U.S. government to ASEAN institutions. And we see this starting with Secretary Clinton many years ago. I think she talks about how many frequent flyer miles she has and how much traveling she did. A lot of that was to Asia. And Secretary Kerry also has carried forth that same commitment to the rebalance into ASEAN institutions, as well as our president, who's planning to travel to the region many times in the next few months. But I would say that from DRL's perspective, it's not only about institution building, ASEAN institution building or others in the region, but it's also about thinking about how we can leverage relationships or strengths between the ASEAN member nations to help each other. So you have this very messy spectrum, nonlinear spectrum of, say, civil society development among ASEAN nations. You have Indonesia and the Philippines on one side. You have Laos and Vietnam on the other side. But they also are naturally inclined to sort of gravitate towards each other, and we can help, provide impetus and opportunities for them to share what they know and what they do well. And I would encourage you to think in terms of that. You also have some very interesting dynamics going on in ASEAN. So, for example, if you look at the ethnic competition in Burma, where you have Buddhist majorities and the Muslim minorities, in Indonesia you also have this ethnic competition, but you have it in a Muslim majority country. So there are very interesting angles that you can play with when talking about working regionally in ASEAN. And, surprisingly, when you're talking about a spectrum, it also means that there are opportunities for countries that aren't necessarily all the way there themselves to bring those countries that are further along on the spectrum in the sort of bad direction, along, and help them make progress. So for example, Vietnam, interestingly, being able to help Laos along, on the spectrum. I mean, there are some very counterintuitive and interesting things going on in the region. I would also say, and I think, again, this is probably obvious to all of you, but I will restate it because the Trans-Pacific Partnership is a huge dynamic for the U.S. government in this region. If we put aside the politics of the vote and ratification and all that, we're still talking about really significant movements and conversations and political alignments that have gone behind getting us to where we are now. And that's as important, or at least it's not unimportant, and that's significant aside from all the other factors of the vote and when that will happen and all that. It also has prompted a lot of debates about economic integration within ASEAN and also between Northeast and Southeast Asia. So not only are there those opportunities with labor rights, obviously, but also with good governance, anti-corruption, and also internet freedom. These are all somehow represented within the TPP text, and it continues to frame the conversations about, and the agendas, frankly, for where these countries are moving. And then finally, I would just say, in terms of a little bit more specifics, DRL and I think your own organizations, we work with a combination of push and pull in the region, but also within these individual countries. So in China, for example, we push up against the shrinking space for civil society and the human rights defenders. We push against the repressive laws, the NGO law, the national security laws. And we also do so in the DPRK, DRL being only one part of a whole of government approach. We have a very important role in our bilateral relationship with DPRK. We document violators. We support and amplify voices of those who have been victims of the regime. And importantly, we aim to increase information flow. And then we see, in the case of Burma, of course, we have to talk about Burma, right? This is historic. We also push and pull because we all know, everyone in this room knows that we're not quite there yet, are we, on Burma? We have some great gains. The Burmese people have seen great gains, but we have not seen democratic consolidation. So we pull along. We try to help build momentum for the new government. But we also press up against military involvement in the economy and, in these sort of unconstitutional, well, actually constitutional, but we would say unacceptable and non-democratic means. And so those are a few of my thoughts. I hope those are helpful for you. And I'm happy to follow up and talk or take questions. And did I convince anybody to bid on EAP? Anybody new? Did I? Yes? Okay. Thank you for your time. Appreciate it.
Great. Good morning. I'm really happy to be here. And maybe before I start, could I also get a show of hands for folks who work on Africa? Pretty good. I see a little bit of double dipping here, but that's fine. That's no problem. Just as my colleague extolled the virtues of working in the EAP region, I will do the same for Africa. I think personally, given the number of countries that make up the region, which at least the way the State Department divides it up is 49, and the sheer diversity of issues in this area, whether it's anti-corruption, whether it's civilian protection, whether it's mass atrocities prevention, whether it's civil society strengthening, media freedom, you get a little bit of everything. And frankly, in terms of my work and looking at the continent, sub-Saharan Africa as a whole, every day is fairly unpredictable. I really, I wake up in the morning, I'm not always sure exactly what I'm going to get, but it will be interesting. Some of it will be shocking, some of it will be heartening, and it all depends. So just in terms of some of the priorities that we focused on, and maybe on the outset, one thing I'd like to emphasize is that, it's been a really interesting year, and one that will continue through next year when it comes to the elections front. I have a quick stat here when it comes to how many elections are actually going to be held, but 40 of the countries I mentioned will hold national elections through the beginning of this year through the end of 2018. And we've had clusters of elections that have taken place in the last month. Some have been good, like in Central African Republic, surprisingly. Some have been historic, like we saw in Nigeria last year. Others have been, rigged and really sham elections, like we've seen in places like Congo Brazzaville and Ethiopia. And then other places, we're wondering if there's going to be elections at all, like the DRC. So, like I said, you get a little bit of everything. But one of the first priorities I would emphasize when it comes to Africa that we've really focused on is the issue of democratic succession. And that is ultimately about elections to some degree, but it also is it's about the build-up to elections. It's about having a political opposition and having a vibrant civil society that can allow citizens to participate. It's about making sure when you have elections that you have observers and you have a process that's run cleanly and fairly. And then it's about working to build governance after the elections happen, whether it's with a leader who has a renewed mandate or whether it's with a new party in a new government completely. One of the square things that I think a lot of folks have thought about when it comes to the democratic succession issue has been the emphasis on term limits and specifically trying to advance a policy where leaders don't change constitutions or modify constitutions for personal gain. This is something that for us I think was really a huge moment was last year at the African Union when President Obama personally highlighted this policy and described why it was such an important thing to uphold. The actual implementation of this policy, of which many of you have been instrumental in different ways in terms of helping us advance this, has been mixed and extremely challenging. There have been a few instances where things have worked out in a positive direction, and Burkina Faso is one of those, which is one of the reasons why I'm going there next week. There have been several instances of places where this is not we have not obtained the policy objectives that we looked for. Rwanda is an example. Burundi is an extreme example where things have really descended into violence, and Congo Brazzaville is another example where we just had a very poor election, and we are where we are. So that's something as a challenge that we'll continue pushing. I do think when it comes to this issue and this priority that it doesn't start and end with the countries that I've mentioned, and it doesn't start and end with the particular elections that I've mentioned. I think it's a generational effort that even if you have a bad election, even if you have rulers who are longstanding who aren't going to leave power right away, you are speaking to future generations and others who will become politically involved, and I think you have to set the groundwork now, and I think you are really instrumental in that. Second thing I would point to is security force accountability. This is something where across the continent we've seen we have large documentation of abuses, of overreach, of extrajudicial actions, and it's something that we've pushed on hard with your help. Nigeria is a good case in point, where, especially in the last administration under President Goodluck Jonathan, the reports coming out, especially in the northeast of the country, were pretty horrific when it comes to different tactics, whether it was arbitrary and mass detentions, whether it was civilian protection concerns, scorched earth tactics, and so forth. We are working with the government. We are working with different security force elements to change behavior. We are working with communities directly, both in terms of early warning systems and help give them the best means and ability to document what's happening and to protect themselves. And it's something that I think is not only important for us, it's life or death. And it's something that, for us, I think extends to other countries as well. South Sudan, we have a documentation project that is looking specifically at the types of abuses on both sides that occurred and is occurring as a result of the civil war there. So there's lots of areas and lots of places to work on when it comes to this issue. Third thing I would mention is the notion of protecting civil society space and NGO space. This is under threat in many countries. Ethiopia is a good example. Uganda passed a law recently. And there's many other places alongside the continent where there's copycat behavior, where they look at some of the legislation on the books and they say, well, why don't we do that? NGOs, are a nuisance. They force us to be more accountable. They're forcing us to be transparent. They ask tricky questions that make us uncomfortable. Why don't we regulate them under many different guises and under many different forms? And so working to counteract that, whether it's working with parliaments, whether it's working directly with civil society groups to raise awareness, working with other partners to push back, but this is a huge concern and one that extends far beyond the African continent. Finally, something I want to make sure to emphasize is the corruption kleptocracy nexus. This is something that I believe is a central element and one that is directly running against our efforts to promote democratic succession in democratic space. I think when you look across the continent and you see all the different strongmen and leaders who have been in power for decades, whether it's within Central Africa, whether it's in Southern Africa, so many of these people who are in power and so many of the inner circle that support them do so because of long-standing, consolidated kleptocratic networks. And I think, honestly, if you start to trace the money and you start to think about what the money is supporting, you eventually get to the power. And if you want to promote democratic objectives in the continent, you have to look at the source of money. You can't disassociate the two, and you can't think that one isn't directly connected to the other. So part of what I think we need to do, and something that we're really supporting, is to understand better where the money is flowing. And then we've been working with a number of groups on that in a variety of contexts, whether it's the Central African Republic, whether it's South Sudan, and I think there's a lot more work to do. I think the next thing then is, once we're able to better document where the money trail goes to, is to understand what tools do we have at our disposal, what tools do we have multilaterally to be able to affect change, how do we expose some of the practices that are there, and what will citizens do in response. And I think really kind of trying to grapple and understand much better those linkages, and to think of corruption and kleptocracy as something that is a core part of our human rights and democracy agenda, is something I hope to see continue and advance, beyond sort of this administration and what we're talking about. Final thing I want to just mention is that if I were to point right now throughout the remainder of the year to sort of two countries that I think is taking up a significant amount of interagency, State Department, and DRL time, I would point to number one, the Congo, DRC, and number two, Nigeria, and really for opposite reasons. In the DRC, I think we are continuing to move towards a really uncertain period, one where it's unclear when elections will happen, and one where we have a country that is so big, so important, and so at risk of instability if the wrong decisions are made, that we have to focus our attentions and think about what strategies and what type of interventions, what type of policies we can do to try to forestall that. So that has taken up a lot of our time, and I think it's where so many of the different issues come together in many different ways, from corruption to security force accountability to broader civilian protection. The second country, Nigeria, I think is sort of the opposite, where we really have an opportunity right now, I think, to help support a government led by President Buhari, who is doing the right thing, who faces a significant struggle, who is trying to turn around a ship that for too long has been beset by corruption and other issues, human rights abuses and so forth. But I think it really is committed, gingerly, but is committed towards doing the right thing. And I think to the extent that we can support those efforts, we can continue pushing them in the right direction, we'll all be in a better place for Africa's largest economy. So anyway, thank you. I appreciate the opportunity to speak to you today, and I'll turn it over to my colleague.
Well, thank you. Good morning. I'm not going to ask for show of hands, but I will urge those who haven't been working in the Western Hemisphere to think about working with those who have, because as you'll see from some of the things I'm going to say, there's a lot of experience in other parts of the world that I believe is like directly transferable now and could be really good models to utilize in the region. We're dealing with really two kinds of writ large human rights problems. One is the governments who still are the major repressors of people's human rights and freedoms. Namely, you look at Cuba, which is the classic example, Venezuela, and there are a few others as well. And then the other set of problems are governments that are, and somebody mentioned, are democratically elected, where there's civil society is able to operate and so on, but have either serious policy or institutional problems, and where you have non-state actors that are also causing some real serious human rights problems. And this is countries like Mexico, the Central American countries. So I thought I would hit those two categories. Cuba is, I think we've got a real opportunity, or more better said, the Cuban people have a real opportunity coming up here. You all saw the president's trip to Cuba, and I think he succeeded in pulling off what he was trying to convey. One was, okay, you guys have been upset with our policy towards Cuba because it was an anachronism from the Cold War, and he said, okay, I accept that, and we're changing our policy. By the way, your system is an anachronism from the Cold War, and you need to change that too. Why is it that Cuba is the only country that doesn't have an elected government? Why is it the only country where you can't have a real NGO, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera? So he laid that down, I think, very clearly. The fact that he was successful in it is, I think, indicated by the fact the Cubans have, even though they've had the speech on TV, they have not allowed it to be published in Cuba. And they continue to run propaganda against it, trying to take his words and distort it to show that he was still threatening. That was the other part of his message, which was a little more subtle, which is, hey, I'm an easygoing guy, and what kind of a threat am I to you? So again, how can you justify all these repressive measures to meet a threat that isn't there? So he's really, I think, set the stage for shaking up the narrative that the Cuban Communist Party has tried to put on people. The other opportunity is the biological one, which is that the Castro brothers are getting very, very old, and they said they're not going to, Raul's not going to run again. Yeah, finally. But you know, there are other little Castros in the wings, and others around. So you know, there are these opportunities there, but what we aren't doing very well, or at this point, is presenting the concrete policy opportunities that would allow you to take advantage of them. And I look at the problem with Cuba, it's sort of like having a sock that has 75 holes in it. You know, if you're going to fix it, where do you start? If you put one stitch in one hole and one over here and one over here, you still end up with 75 holes. So somebody's got to say, look, first we want to fix this, and then we're going to fix that one, and then we're going to fix that one. That has to be driven by the people in Cuba who are seeking reform and a democratic outcome, so that they're giving us cues. It's really hard for us right now because they say, well, we want the government to recognize us. Okay, great. What does that mean? We understand the laws for registering NGOs are completely ridiculous and nobody is able to get registered, but how exactly would you change them? What should we be pressing the Cubans to do? What should we be urging the EU and other allies in the region to be urging them to do? So we need that. Even on something that's relatively simple like release political prisoners, when you're dealing with the top-tier prisoners, that's relatively easy. We can go in and say you ought to do this, or you ought to remove the travel restrictions on the 11 remaining 75ers. I mean, those ones you get to. But when you go in with people who are sort of fourth or fifth rank on the list of political prisoners, and the Cubans say, oh, well, that guy's in for attempted murder. If we don't have the granularity of detail about their case, it's hard for us to argue with them. So that's another area where granularity is going to be really important. Election systems. The Cubans say they're going to reform the electoral code in the run-up to the renovation of the communist leadership. Yeah. Yeah. Tomorrow. And you can imagine how wonderful it's going to be. But that's another one where we need guidance from people on the island of saying, okay, what precise changes do we want to push in that area to try to give ourselves a better opportunity? So there's a lot of work to be done there, but I think the big theme I would get across is, you know, the people you're all working with need to be moving from just saying the situation is bad to saying here is how we would change it, here's our plan going forward. And that's where I think, you know, experiences in other parts of the world where people have made transitions, there's some very good practical political knowledge to be drawn there and advice to be given that could help Cuban opposition do that. Venezuela is another opportunity in a sense. You know, all the indicators right now are that the country is just headed into a death spiral on the economic side. They have hardly any water left in the main dam that generates electrical power, so they're starting to ration electrical power, but they're way too late in doing that. They can't, very soon won't be able to service their debt. They can't keep up all their pension payments and so on. And some people are saying, oh, isn't that great? You know, it's going to collapse. But I watched the same predictions in the early 90s with Cuba, where the cutoff of the Soviet subsidy, I mean, people were eating rats, and everybody said, oh, the regime will collapse. And oddly enough, the weakness became the strength, because the regime's main message was, it's either the status quo or total chaos. So which would you rather have? And people opted for not chaos. And I think that's kind of where Venezuela is headed, is, you know, Maduro is going to say, well, it's me or complete chaos. And that's a lousy choice to face people with. You've got a platform there with the elected parliament who, you know, they may not be able to enact laws and get the Supreme Court to uphold them, but at least they can propose things and drive a narrative. But again, they need to have a positive alternative to either the status quo or complete chaos. They need to be showing what is it that we should be doing as a matter of policy that would get us out of this terrible situation we're in. And that's going to, again, require a lot of advice and experience from other parts of the world, and their laying down an agenda can give us something to play off of. You've got similar problems in, you know, smaller ways in Bolivia, Nicaragua, Ecuador, but I'd say the two are the really big ones there. The other kind of problem that I mentioned is the non-state actors and the governments that are unable and to a certain extent maybe unwilling to deal with things. This is Mexico and Central America. And there we're trying to find the right combination of, you know, pressing the governments for change, pressing them to stand up to and helping them to stand up to narco-traffickers and the corruption and so on that it brings about. But at the same time, you need civil society in the countries to be coming up with, again, concrete policy alternatives, things to press on the government. Somebody mentioned the LGBT laws in the Caribbean, and that's a really good example. You know, where do you start? Which law do you want changed? What is the exact change you want, so that we can go in and advocate for that? So I think throughout the region, what I'm really arguing for is a lot more granularity. It's no longer sufficient to just be raising awareness of the human rights problems in the region. You need to be offering concrete solutions and organizing all the advocates who are pushing for those to bring those solutions to the fore. And that's just sort of the last thing I would do, is that in terms of expanding the countries that are aiding and doing that. I mean, we have done that effectively, but I think what we're seeing in Western Hemisphere now is there are a lot of countries that used to be on the receiving end of our assistance and advice and so on are now willing and able and serve as good models to provide that kind of advice and drive to some of the other places that haven't resolved their problems yet. And so more we can do to encourage that at the people-to-people level as well as the government-to-government level would be good. So that's all. I'm happy to deal with any questions, comments.
On that note, unfortunately, we are past our schedule.
Oh, sorry.
So what I would like to do is to offer that we have to take a very short break to rearrange for a video. If you would make yourselves available, maybe out in the break room. But I do want to say thank you to our DASs and those who are stepping in. These are the guys, women and men, who make this work. And you can hear we are doing all kinds of work around the world. They've got very busy schedules, that they took this time out to be here today. I want to thank them very much for that.